Okay, welcome back to our series on Mark. Today we're looking at another section out of Mark chapter 1, verses 21 through to 34. It's a bit of a longer section than before, and that is because I eventually actually want to get through the book of Mark without it taking 24 hours. We are going to live up to the promise of this series, which is we're not going to overthink it too much. We're just going to read these texts. We're going to draw out something meaningful and important out of the text, and then we're going to keep going. So let's have a look. If you recall the context, if you haven't seen the other videos, we have just introduced Jesus Christ, the Son of God, right in the first line. That's what Mark tells us, so we kind of know where he's headed with some of this information. Then we have looked at the announcement of Jesus coming with John the Baptist. Then we have looked at Jesus' baptism, and then we have looked at Jesus being led into the wilderness to be tested or tempted, depending on which word you want to use. And then he has called his disciples. They left their nets to follow him. And here we are now at verse 21. And they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath he entered the synagogue and was teaching. They were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one who had authority and not as the scribes. And immediately there was in the synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying out with a loud voice, came out of him. And they were all amazed, so that they questioned amongst themselves, saying, "What is this? A new teaching with authority? He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." And at once his fame spread everywhere throughout all the surrounding region of Galilee. And immediately he left the synagogue and entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now Simon's mother-in-law lay ill with a fever, and immediately they told him about her. And he came and took her by the hand and lifted her up, and the fever left her, and she began to serve them. That evening at sundown, they brought to him all who were sick or oppressed by demons, and the whole city was gathered together at the door. And he healed many who were sick with various diseases, and cast out many demons. And he would not permit the demons to speak, because they knew him. So, what can we summarize? What can we draw out? Now, it would be easy to think, as you read this passage, that its principal focus was, in fact, the miracles that Jesus was working. And certainly they are important and not to be ignored. But I don't think that is the bigger picture. I don't think that is the bigger picture of this particular section, because we need to look at what Mark is attempting to do here. He has already introduced us to the concept right in the first line that this is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And then what he has said since then has gone towards establishing the truth of that statement. And so what we will find is that he is going to do that for some time, sort of almost through the first 8 chapters or so in Mark, before it makes a fairly dramatic transition into a slightly different mode, I guess, a different timeline in what he is trying to talk about. But what we have here is the following things have happened to support Mark's statement. First, we have the prophecy about Jesus Christ, the forerunner, that is John the Baptist, one crying in the wilderness, "Make straight the way for the Lord." Now, we've got this sort of introduction there to support the idea that, of course, firstly, John the Baptist was that person who was promised. Secondly, that person was the forerunner to the Christ, the promised one, the Messiah. And then we have Jesus come along, and John points him out, and of course he is confirmed at that time, at the commencement of his ministry, by the presence of God, and in particular the voice of God and the Holy Spirit. He is then led out where he is tempted by Satan in the wilderness, again confirming a few things about the Christ that we need to know and that are important for us to understand biblically and theologically going forward, which are, in no particular order, firstly, that he was tempted as we are tempted. Secondly, that he was a man. And thirdly, that he was able to resist those temptations. These are important things, and we need to be aware of them going forward as we sort of develop this narrative around who Jesus Christ was. Then we have the idea of him calling his disciples to him, and we have talked about that previously. But what we actually don't know yet is, what's the deal with Jesus? Why is he good? Why is he the promised one? What is going on in the spiritual realm and in the physical realm that makes Jesus something different, someone different that we have not necessarily come across before? And then we transition to this section. Now, I think a lot of people have said a lot of things about this section, and I don't want to overwork it particularly. I think the important thing to draw out of this section, which takes place roughly in a sort of day, including the next little bit, it's basically a 24-hour window in the life of Jesus. He is teaching at the synagogue. Interesting comment there, because of course he was allowed to teach at the synagogue. So we could maybe surmise a few things there about what he may or may not have had going on in previous unspoken parts that were taking place. But there he was teaching, and it says that people were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one who had authority. And that, I think, is the key word of this entire passage. We look at what is happening here, and Mark is establishing the authority of Christ in this section. And he does it in three particular sections that really canvas everything we need to know about the authority and lordship of Jesus Christ. Now, I said in one of the previous sections, at least I think I said, it has been a while since I did it, that following Jesus involves at least knowing something about what you're getting into. And here we see the starting point of establishing Jesus' authority as Lord. Okay? I will come back to that because it's something that's fairly important. We see it first in his teaching. Now, they say that people were astonished at his teaching because he taught as one who had authority. What does that mean? Most people tend to agree that the distinction Mark is making is between scribes, who were, I guess, best thought of as the biblical scholars of the time, and Jesus, who was speaking from his own authority. So what scribes had a tendency to do, and these were not secretaries, these were learned people, okay? They spent their lives dedicated to biblical study. So we can't just dismiss them as being incompetent or foolish. But of course, the way they learned is to learn what other people had said about the scriptures and be knowledgeable about that. Whereas what we have with Jesus is that he's a primary source, I guess is the best way to do it. If you've done any study, there's a difference between a primary source and a secondary source. The scribes were very big on secondary sources, but Jesus spoke from his own authority and information. That's really the distinction we are making here. It doesn't say particularly his style. It doesn't say that he was particularly excellent public speaker. It doesn't really say much about the content of his speaking other than that he spoke with authority. So here we have section 1. He has authority in teaching. That is, he is an authority figure when it comes to the word of God. And that's not too surprising if you know how Jesus is described in various places, in particular throughout the book of John. But we don't need to get into that now. The second thing that happens then is we have a man comes into the synagogue with an unclean spirit. Now this phrase, this translation, unclean spirit, it's actually translated as demon or as evil spirit. It tends to mean slightly different things contextually, but the phrase is actually the same. So I don't think we need to get hung up about the particular use of that word in this section. But the relevant part is here, for our purposes today, that Jesus says, "Be silent and come out of him," and it does. Now we can analyze the specifics of the spirit, but again, high level look, the point of adding this story in here is to establish Jesus' authority over evil spirits. We have his authority as a teacher. We have his authority over evil spirits. And so it's not too surprising that we then move on after these events and we go straight to the house of Simon and Andrew, where we have Simon's mother-in-law who lay ill with a fever. It does not say the fever was caused by an evil spirit. It just says she lay ill with a fever. It was probably pretty bad from the sounds of it, because they went to the trouble of telling him about it immediately. And lo and behold, he came to her, took her by the hand and lifted her up, and the fever left her and she began to serve them. What do we have then? We have Jesus' authority over the physical realm. So here we have Mark establishing Jesus' authority as a teacher of the word. We have Mark establishing Jesus' authority over evil spirits. And we have Mark establishing Jesus' authority over the physical world. This is Mark introducing us in a very quick few paragraphs to the concept of Jesus as Lord, as an authority figure, both in the physical realm and the spiritual realm in particular. And that is the principal thing I think Mark is trying to do here. Now, you can break these stories down into tiny, tiny, tiny little pieces and you can examine them. But if you are reading through this, what you need to take away is that Mark has just finished describing how Jesus' ministry commenced. The first thing he's then gone into telling us about is who was this Jesus person. We've seen some of the things that he's done, but now we're starting to get an idea of who he actually was, what his place actually is, and a little bit of a flavor for how things are going to go through the rest of the book of Mark. So that's all I wanted to say in relation to that particular passage. We are going to move on and deal with a couple of things that have come up here, but they are dealt with better in different sections. So if you take away one thing from there, authority, I've said it enough, and that's all for this one. I'll see you next time.